Hello everyone and welcome to an episode of Alec Codes. I'm your host Alec. I'm going to be teaching you the difference between overwriting and overloading. Now overwriting is where you have a method with the same exact signature as one in your superclass. This is a little bit different than overloading, where you have two methods within the same class that have the same method name, but they have in different parameters. Now, I'll be showing some examples of this going forward. That's all you really need to know about overloading and overwriting. I'll get into more detail. Let's dive in. Now, in this example, I have a main method and I have a bark method. The main method is just simply calls the bark method, and the bark method, since it's void, all it can do is not return anything, but rather I just have it printing out the word bark. If you go ahead and press play, you can see down here in the corner it says bark. Now, overwriting is where you take a method signature and you revamp it for some sort of special purpose, such as adding different parameters to this method. In the case of a bark, let's go with something more specialized. Let's go ahead and do public static void bark. Oh, let's see what it says. It says bark is already defined in Howl. And now this is where overwriting comes in, where you can specify a specific parameter that you want to pass it. In this case, I'm going to pass it animal count, if I can spell right. And so now it treats it as a completely different method. We have bark, and then we have bark, but we pass it in a number, and it'll go into this method rather than the first method. So if we do something like if animal count is greater than 3, we can do a system.out.println howl. So now if we have more than 3 animals who are barking, they will start up a howl. And we can go ahead and try and catch the other instances where, say, it's less than 3 or equal to 3. We can do something like this where we return it, which simply means if we go into this if statement at all, it will then stop out of this method. So if the animal count is 4, it'll check right here, it'll print out the word howl, and then it'll completely jump out of this method. It won't even go down any further. So if we don't go into it, we can simply default to doing a system.out.println. Actually, no, my bad. We simply call bark again. Bark. So now it'll check if there's more than 3 animals. If not, it'll just return a normal bark. So if we go ahead and call it, originally we have simply bark, but now we can do bark. Bark 5, which should be a howl in this case. So we have bark from the first method call, howl from the second method call, and then let's do one more. Let's do bark 2. And this should check here if it's greater than 3, which it's not. It completely skips this if statement and just simply calls normal bark. And now we move over to overwriting. Overwriting is a little bit different to overloading, and it can get pretty confusing with all these different O's and signatures and method names, but in the simplest way I can put it, overwriting is when you have a subclass and its method, one of its methods, are the exact same as its superclass. And this method will kind of, I don't want to kind of, rely too heavily on the word overriding, but the subclass overwrites what the superclass does. And I'm going to go ahead and give you an example of that. In this class here, my overwriting class, we have 2 more classes. We have a class called vehicle, and we have a class called car, which extends vehicle. Now this extends is what does all the overwriting stuff here. Now vehicle has one method, and it's called type, and all it does is return I am a vehicle. And car has the same method, and it says I am a car. Now you could look at this and you might say, oh yes, if you call car.type, it's going to say, I'm a car because it's right here. But this is where we start looking at something like this, where if we call ambiguous, I forgot to mention, I actually have another class called ambiguous. We have ambiguous that extends vehicle, but I didn't actually put anything in here. It's empty. So if I call ambiguous, where does it go? Well, because it extends vehicle, I can call ambiguous.type, and it'll return I am a vehicle. While if I do car.type, it overrides the vehicle type, I am a vehicle, and gives it its own special one, I am a car. So up here at the top, we have car is equal to new car. Alright, it's confusing enough. So basically we create an object called car, and I create an object called ambiguous. And if I do car.type, it'll go into this car class, and it'll pull up type, and it'll simply print out I'm a car. While ambiguous will go in here. There's nothing here. It goes to vehicle instead and says I am a vehicle. So here we go. If I print it out, I actually already had it printed out here. It says I am a car and I am a vehicle. And that's what ambiguous is. It's a vehicle. So that's basically the gist of it. If I can go over it one more time. The overriding is when you take the method of a superclass and you pump it into your subclass and you rewrite it and make it on something really specific. I mean, it doesn't have to be I am a car. You can print out whatever you want. You can do really fancy things with it, like return. No, that's not going to work. But I mean, I think you guys understand what I'm saying here. Versus overloading, which I mentioned before, where it's in the same class, and in the same class you can have methods of the same names, but you'll have to define it differently with the different parameters. I really do hope this all makes sense. If you have any questions, please leave it in the comments below. Thank you so much for listening. I'm Alec, and you've been listening to Alec Codes.